He is the president of Texas Values, a group dedicated to preserving and advancing a culture of family values in the state of Texas. Prior to leading Texas Values, Jonathan headed the Liberty Institute offices at the Texas Capitol in Austin, where he served as Director of Legislative Affairs and attorney for Liberty Institute. I think we're all familiar with the good work of Liberty Institute. He frequently presents research analysis and testimony before the Texas Legislature, Texas Board of Education, and other government entities on various issues affecting faith, family, and freedom. Mr. Saenz received his law degree from the University of Houston, his undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin. He is a native Texan, fifth generation, who grew up in Houston, and he and his family live in Buda and are members of the Santa Cruz Catholic Church. Please welcome Jonathan Saenz.
All right, good evening. How y'all doing?
Great.
We're all excited and energized after that great speech by General Abbott. That was fantastic. What an honor to be here with him, to get to follow him, to be here with y'all, and just to live in a state like Texas that is definitely exceptional. I'm going to talk about judges and elections related to that. Before I get into that, though, I want to just give you a little background about the work that I'm involved in. Also want to direct you to some resources. Just don't forget before you leave, there's a resource in the back of this room over here when you leave. It's called the Texas Legislative Guide. So the organization that I lead is called Texas Values. So we do a lot of work where we advocate for certain issues and give people insight, but we also have resources. So we want to empower you as well. We don't want you to just be dazzled by our words and our work. We want you to go out there and do the great things that we know you can do. So those are outside, and I'll pass around a few just so people can get an idea of what it is. The other thing I want to direct y'all to, and I've got some copies of this here, but a ton of copies just outside the room waiting for you, is a handout talking about the new Merry Christmas law in the state of Texas. So I won't spoil the surprise that Santa has for you. I'll let you read it for yourself. But I have some handouts for you on that. I'm excited to be here with y'all tonight. Every time I speak to a Tea Party group, I always worry that, I'm going to have to call some of my other lawyer friends and, we're going to have to get involved in a court case because you guys are dangerous, right? I mean, y'all are the ones that stir things up. You got the IRS after you. I mean, goodness, I mean, y'all must be doing some good stuff, right? You got Obama worried, I guess. Texas, right? Love it. Oh my God. It's great to be a Texan. I'm fifth generation Texan, so this is, no better place. And one of the honors that I had in 2009, and I believe I'm right on this, the first Tea Party event ever held at the state capitol, I actually had the honor of getting to speak. And I was doing some work inside the Capitol and working with elected officials and some of the work I do. And it was right in the middle of the session, and I had not even been outside yet that day. And they're like, "Oh, come out at this time." So I come out. There's like a sea of 5,000 people. Texas Tea Party strong. It was awesome. So I was excited to be a part of that. But in case y'all aren't aware of the group Texas Values, who's heard of the group Texas Values? Handful of people. Okay, so I'm doing a decent job. I got some work to do. For a number of years, I worked for an organization called Liberty Institute, headed by Kelly Shackelford. How many of y'all are familiar with that? A few more. Good deal. So for a long time, I was the staff attorney and also the legislative director for Liberty Institute, heading up our offices in Austin. And then about a year ago, what we decided, there was so much work going on issues of faith, family, and freedom, that we needed an organization that just focused on Texas, as Liberty Institute went more of a national direction, working on litigating religious liberty cases across the country, but also in the state of Texas. But we wanted to have a group in the state of Texas that worked with groups like Tea Party groups and so on to educate them about the important issues. Tell them what's happening at the Capitol, what's happening in their local community. Be a resource, give them insight, give them analysis, and be an advocate where necessary So a year ago, we started a group called Texas Values. And part of the reason somebody was asking me about this, how'd you come up with the name of Texas Values? The three issues that we work on are faith, family, and freedom. I'm fifth generation Texan. When I think about Texas values, I think about faith, family, and freedom. And for a little while here, we've had people coming into our state trying to tell us what Texas values are. We said enough of that. It's time to take that label back, to take that name back, and to remind everybody, in case they forgot, what Texas values are all about. So that's what our group is involved in, and just to connect y'all with some of the work, it's very interesting because we see a lot of attacks on these issues in our own state that we care about: faith, family, and freedom. Attacks on those issues and those principles and ideals and those values. And a lot of it does have an impact on who's at the bench, who's being appointed, the judge that's involved in a particular case. So many of these things that you care about, that I care about, that people work on in our state are put into law or put into practice, and eventually they end up in front of some judge, oftentimes one judge, that makes a decision that could end all the great work that you did or you were involved in. I know one of the battles we were involved in for a little while at the State Board of Education, which is a place that many people aren't quite aware of what happens there, but some of you all are, with the C-scope issue in Common Core. But a couple of years ago, a big battle there is whether or not we could teach our students the concept of American exceptionalism. I want you to think about that for a second. Whether in our state of Texas, it was okay for us to teach our students about the concept of American exceptionalism. And there were people talking about it like, that we should be ashamed of America, and, we shouldn't be so bold and so proud of who we are. Why not? I mean, how will we get to a place in our own country where we cannot teach our own students what makes America great? So our group was right there fighting for that. We stood with some Tea Party patriots, people that are in office now, like Senator Donna Campbell was right there with us, in a great group that we've done some work with, King Street Patriots out of the Houston area. And as a result of that battle there, not only was American exceptionalism now in the required teaching in our state, but required teaching of our U.S. Constitution, and specifically the words of the First Amendment are required teaching. So I'm excited about that. So let's talk about the issue of judges and the things that are going on and how this relates to it. When you think about judges running for office, I think some people are I don't even think a lot of people are aware of that. They get to the ballot and, they're surprised. They're not in the practice of law. They're not as familiar with it. But so many of these issues that we deal with, we see at the local level, we see things coming from the federal level, end up in our courts. And just to give you a couple of examples, you think about laws that are passed, but then you think about the federal court. You think about Roe versus Wade, a right to an abortion. That was not a bill that was passed. That did not go through the legislative process. That went through the court system. That right came out of 5 judges, if you will. The Ten Commandments case that General Abbott argued, that was a part of our state, that actually went a way that I agree with, that has the Ten Commandments at the state capitol, that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. 5 votes. That wasn't legislation. That was a court case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, took a number of years. But there it is. 5 judges making that decision. Could have went the other direction, and it has gone the other direction in other cases where facts have been a little bit different. But right here, close, not too far away, I guess it was in Tarrant County, Dallas County, this judge, Tina Callahan, dealt with the issue of same-sex divorce when it was clear that our state doesn't recognize same-sex marriage. Why would we recognize same-sex divorce? She made it very clear that she was going to challenge the constitutionality, if you will, of our state law. Even though 76% of Texans that went to the ballot box voted in favor of marriage being between one man and one woman. So just to give you an idea, in case you were thinking about, well, what are some issues that deal with our fundamental principles and our liberties and things that Tea Party groups that maybe you guys care about, that have happened in court, not to mention some of the free speech issues that have come up with groups like yourself that have been involved in trying to hold the government accountable. So I have a couple of copies of some judicial questions that I'm going to hand out. And so I do not have, they're 4 or 5 pages long. I do not have 150 or 200 copies. So I've got some copies that I'm going to hand out, and I want y'all to pass around, and you can see the different examples of these issues that are coming up and questions that our organization has used in the past on these issues. And I'm just going to have this gentleman work with me here. Thank you. We have, our organization has been involved in voters' guides. We're in a church, so I want to give you all some insight just for a second too, if I'll step back on this. A lot of times people are worried that in a church, can you have voters' guides and can you talk about these issues or whatever? It is completely legal for churches to be involved in voter registration. It's completely legal for churches to have a nonpartisan voters' guide. Our organization, and along with Liberty Institute, have a 40-year legacy of working on voters' guides, having nonpartisan. We don't tell you who to vote for. We produce a questionnaire to candidates, and then we let them answer the questions. And then we produce those answers on a website. So the questions that I'm circulating and have a couple of copies of, you can find at freevotersguide.com. So there was a Supreme Court decision in 2002, the Republican Party of Minnesota versus White, that talked about these issues with judicial candidates, and the Supreme Court held that canons of judicial ethics that prohibit candidates from elective office from announcing their views on disputed legal or political issues was unconstitutional, and that this particular canon violated the First Amendment because it prohibited speech on the basis of content, and it burdened the free speech of candidates in public office. So here's what I want. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that you can ask the judges, but as a disclaimer, something that we encourage candidates to freely say and be comfortable with is that there is an understanding that not what you're being asked and your response, we understand that judges have an obligation to follow binding precedent of the higher courts, applicable constitutional and statutory provisions, and to decide future case based on the law and the facts of the case. We understand a judge's response does not indicate their current view on an issue and doesn't constitute a pledge or a promise or a commitment to rule in a particular way. And that's something that we want candidates to realize is we understand they have a duty, they go by a particular judicial code of conduct, but it is certainly helpful for voters to have an idea of their identity and what their philosophy is on these issues. And so some of the questions that we've asked before, we've asked them, what of the former U.S. presidents represents your political philosophy? Going even back as far as JFK, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, talking about those that are not currently in elective office. And so I know there may be some opinions about President Obama, but pertaining to presidents that have been in office before. The other question that we've used quite a bit is to ask them what particular justice of the U.S. Supreme Court reflects their judicial philosophy. How many of y'all read, the non-lawyers and if there are any judges in this room, but those of you that aren't lawyers and judges, how many of y'all read judicial opinions that come out every week? 1, 2, come on. Law student back there? No. It's very uncommon. How many of y'all, though, may have read a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, or maybe a page or two, okay, maybe a few more hands, at least aware of it, right? So one of the reasons I think that it's helpful to ask the candidates what current justice of the Supreme Court reflects their judicial philosophy is because those are probably opinions that some of us have at least heard of or read about. We have some idea, and it may give us an idea when we go to the ballot box what to think and to make a more informed decision. And so I think that familiarity is very helpful. I mean, you know, I'm a lawyer. I work on a lot of these issues. I know quite a few of the judges, but I don't know all of them. I think that I could name quite a few. But I read a lot of these things in the work I do, but most people do not. And so but these positions are incredibly important. One of the questions that we have on a questionnaire we use very often is to ask the judicial candidate what organizations they give money to, what organizations they volunteer for, what organizations they've served on a board for. We have one, and you can see some of this on our website. We've got one, I think we've got 30 different organizations that we list. Okay? So, ACLU, Texas Public Policy Foundation, Eagle Forum, Gay, Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, Greenpeace, Americans for Prosperity, Texas Right to Life. That information, I think, can give people some insight that maybe they're looking for that they would otherwise not have. And so, and this goes back for the last 10 years is how we've asked, if they've contributed money, they volunteer time. You will see judges be a little bit more guarded because they do want to be careful, particularly if there's pending litigation on an issue that they're not signifying, here's how I'm going to rule. But there's certainly a lot of information that we can use that will help people. One of the other questions that we have gotten to is trying to get an idea of how they feel about fundamental principles and constitutional analysis. One of the questions we use is we ask them to agree or strongly agree or somewhere in the middle that the U.S. Constitution is a living document and should be interpreted according to the circumstances of each generation. Sound like a fair question? Right? There's a lot of discussion about that. How many of y'all have heard of that phrase, that the Constitution is a living document? Right? Okay, so see, to my point, you have somewhat of a familiarity with what that means. Right? When I say stare decisis, who knows what that means? The non-lawyers. Okay? A couple of people. Right? Wade, you want to address stare decisis? I want to get into a stare decisis discussion. I'll put y'all to sleep. But my point is, when we say living document, you know what that means. If sometimes we use the phrase in our questionnaires, if you consider yourself a strict constructionist, an originalist. How many of y'all have heard those terms? Right? A lot of you. So you're a little bit more familiar. The average voter is a little bit more familiar with what that means. One of the questions that we've asked is how the judges feel about the election of judges. Right? Election of judges by the people for a definite term of office is the best way to select judges. So, how do y'all feel about that, Bob? Y'all like electing judges? It certainly has accountability built into it, doesn't it? And we can sit here and argue both ways about, being appointed and they're insulated, whatever. But, if you have a judge that is legislating from the bench, how many of y'all know what that means? Or feel like you do, right? So I think these kind of terms help people form, at least some informed opinion. Because so many times I hear this, and we've been doing a voter's guide for 40 years, but I'm only 40 years old. I haven't done all of them, okay? So I've been in the voter's guide business, if you will, for about 8 years, and I hear all the time people say, I went to vote, but I didn't know the candidate, so I just didn't vote. But that does have an impact on an election. If you actually went to the ballot box, but you didn't vote, I live in a small area. It's pronounced Buda, by the way. We're a little sensitive about that. No. I'm from Houston. I grew up in Houston, and so we've always known how to pronounce that. And so it's funny living in a little town, and people get there's a lot of pride there. But anyway, Buda is south of Austin. We have their T-shirts there sometimes that say "just outside of weird." Anyway, that's Hays County. But anyway, I want y'all to know though, Hays County is conservative as it seems, or a small town. We had a fight there dealing with our religious liberty and whether judges and county commissioners could start our meeting with a prayer. Our organization got involved, and we were there for the elected officials to make sure they could continue that liberty in individuals as well. So even Buda is not a stranger to some of these issues. Nonetheless, so we try to put some terms on here that people will, the average folks, if you will, and don't take that the wrong way, but the folks that aren't in the legal profession, but their rights can be changed and can be altered and impacted by these decisions. One of the questions that we have on here is we ask them to list their educational, military, vocational history, and any church or civic leadership positions. Where did they serve in leadership before? The other thing that we have on here is we ask them to give to give our understanding of their judicial philosophy on maybe a court case that they worked on before. And one of the questions I like is, what in the nature of mankind caused America's founders to carefully define, separate, and limit powers within the Constitution? How many times have you heard or have y'all thought about maybe your concern about judges or a judicial branch, like we talked about before, legislating from the bench, mixing up the separation of powers, right? So if you read that question and wanted to know if how a judge would define and separate and talk about the limit of powers of the Constitution, would you feel like you had understanding of that concept, right? Show of hands, right? The separation of powers is a term most people understand, and if they got an answer to a question, okay, I understand where this judge is coming from on that issue. And this is a very fascinating question here. What is the relationship of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution? Wow, that's an important question, isn't it? Because when you're dealing with a lot of issues, obviously in law, you're dealing with principles. Judges are giving a certain principle. This court ruled this way. This law says this. Here's my role in how I decide this case. It's different than when you're in the legislature. And one reason I know that, at least to some people, is because I heard a comment outside the House. One time I was working with an elected official on a religious liberty issue, and I told him, I said, look, you cannot write the law that way. It violates the U.S. Constitution. There is court case after court case on this. Precedent is absolutely clear. And he told me, Jonathan, we don't do the Constitution at the Capitol. That's the judicial branch's job. Wow. I was like, well, I mean, that may be the case, but I would like to think that our lawmakers are not willfully writing legislation that they know is in violation of the Constitution, just hoping maybe they'll catch a break at the courthouse. But apparently some of them do it that way. Right? And so, so there is supposed to be a difference. I don't agree with his interpretation of that. But there's supposed to be a difference between what happens at the Capitol and what happens in the courthouse. But we've become very concerned about that. So I do think, and I'm hoping these questions will give insight on this and give people a little more awareness of what to expect from a judge, and to send a message to them that while there is a respect for judges, and we don't want them to be biased, and we want them to make a decision based on the law and the facts and all that good stuff, we want them to be reminded that they're elected. And if they're not fulfilling their role the way they should, they may not be reelected. And that they're not above being held accountable or having questions asked to them to where they have to respond to the people. You know, if you think about it, if you're going to run for office, you know, wouldn't you think you would expect to have questions asked of your judicial philosophy? You know, what type of Supreme Court justice that you align with? One of the other interesting questions here is, which court decision do you think has most impacted society? That might tell you a little bit. Which one? We got a lively crowd, eh? Roe versus Wade. One of the questionnaires that we've used before has asked that question. Has asked the judge, and here we're talking about a court case that's already been decided, so I think a lot of people would agree a judge has some flexibility to talk about that and give their analysis. We've heard Justice Scalia, we've heard many judges dissect in different ways a lot of these older cases, significant cases. But one of the questions we've asked before is, in Roe versus Wade, the United States Supreme Court recognized a right to an abortion. The question, the statement is, I believe Roe was correctly decided and the Texas or U.S. Constitution does not recognize a right to an abortion. Agree, disagree, undecided. The other question we ask is about the Supreme Court case that came out of Texas. Roe versus Wade came out of Texas as well. I'm sure you're aware of. But the Santa Fe case, where the Supreme Court ruled that prayer over loudspeakers from a football game would be unconstitutional. Asking the judge what they think about that decision. One of the questionnaires we used before was about the Lawrence v. Texas case. The homosexual sodomy case that went up to the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is these court cases at the Supreme Court, impact things that happen at the local level. Am I right? I mean, we're aware of that. We're seeing that with Obamacare and other issues currently. One of the things I want to touch on too, and I'm happy to electronically send this to y'all. Y'all will have all of these questions. They're on our website, freevotersguide.com is the Voters Guide website we have. But here's something I want you to think about as well. So you think about judges running for office, but what about the judges that get appointed? All right? Who appoints our state judges? Who knows? This guy knows.
Supreme Court?
No.
Oh.
But the Supreme Court guys can't be appointed. But that's a good try. Who had a hand up? Yeah? Governor, right? Governor Perry has been in office quite a while. He's appointed a lot of judges. I think the majority, if not close to all, but maybe a few on the Texas Supreme Court have been appointed by Governor Perry. So when you think about that issue, you're voting for governor. Don't be afraid to ask the candidates about their philosophy on appointing judges, right? And so we think about, sometimes we feel a little handcuffed or whatever on the Supreme Court because it goes into Senate and all that, but how do those judges get on the Supreme Court, right? You want to try again? Who appoints the Supreme Court? Or you want to take a pass?
Judges?
We'll let you take it. Anybody? Who appoints the Supreme Court? This is easy. Come on, everybody raise their hand. President. Okay? Does there somebody else have a role?
Senate.
Thank you. Right? The Senate. Who puts the senators in office?
We do.
Right? Who puts the president in office? We do. Right? So when you're thinking about what was that? Yeah, right. All right. Y'all are a high-level group. But when you think about those candidates that are running for office, are you thinking about what type of judge they would select? You may be, right? And you think about Governor Perry, who's been obviously successful in our state. He's appointed a lot of people, not just in courts, but in other agencies. You talk about some influence. I've heard it argued before, that's one of his greatest legacies, is the amount of people that he's been able to appoint and have that impact. But we see that at the federal level. So when you're thinking about these issues of judges and you think about people that put them in that position, don't forget to ask those candidates that are running for those offices that will have an impact. And the other thing, too, we sometimes forget is that when they run at a local level, state level or whatever, at your county level, city level, they may be in position to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden they have an impact there. The other thing I find interesting is a lot of people don't realize, whether it's the U.S. Supreme Court or the Texas Supreme Court, your ability to get to that highest level court is not guaranteed, right? It's very rare that a court case. So if you have a judge that decides a case and you have a concern with it, maybe you appeal it. Okay, so you have your appeal. It takes years. Maybe you don't agree with the appeal, then you're stuck with that decision, right? I was at the Supreme Court on last Monday because a case came out of Dallas Court of Appeals on the issue of the same-sex divorce that I brought up. So trial court, one judge in Austin said, I'm going to let the divorce take place for a homosexual couple even though we don't recognize same-sex marriage. Let them get a divorce. The one in Dallas County said they didn't get a final divorce, but they let it go. She let it proceed, but then it got appealed. Dallas Court of Appeals said, no, this is a very simple issue. Austin Court of Appeals didn't agree with that decision, right? Has to go up to the Supreme Court. Thankfully, that issue is up at the Supreme Court and they'll be deciding soon. But most of these cases, it really is that trial court judge, that district court judge. And that's, that decision usually holds. It's incredibly expensive, if you didn't already know, to appeal a case to the United States Supreme Court. I've been involved in court cases that have gone all the way up there. They drag out forever. My friend Wade Birdwell's here. He knows a case we worked on that went up to the Texas Supreme Court. How long did it take? 10 years?
3 or 4.
Yeah. Just to get to that from the appellate to the Supreme. So when you think about it, and that is not to suggest that the appellate court judges or the Supreme Court judges, their role is not important. and electing them is not important. And sometimes their role is more visible. And on our voters guide, I will admit, we only deal with the Texas Supreme Court because there's so many judges across the state. It is very difficult to cover all that, so we don't have them all listed. But Wade did provide a resource to me that and someone else mentioned this to me. What Tarrant County does, it goes a little bit in an additional direction on their county website. They ask for lawyers that practice in court to give their opinion and insight on these judges they work for. I think it's a very good resource to see what practitioners are saying about their conduct and about their experience, their judicial philosophies. Credit to Tarrant County for going a little bit further and asking them judicial philosophy about originalism, about a living constitutionalism. And you can see on their website just a breakdown of all these courts. But if I'm able to leave you with anything on this issue, what I want you to be aware of is not to think that judges are off limits when it comes to asking them questions. If they are uncomfortable answering a question, that's up to them to decide, and it's up to you to decide how you feel about that. If they feel that, it may impact a case they work on, whatever. But don't be afraid to ask the question, because I think that's one of the concerns we have, is people think that they're not allowed to do that, and judges think they're not allowed to answer certain questions. And that was what was covered in this Supreme Court case that I referenced, the Republican Party of Minnesota versus White in 2002. But I think that even though, judges may be uncomfortable doing that, some of them may be, I think it's a win-win situation. And because we see so much litigation on so many important issues, Obamacare was talked about a number of times, other court cases were talked about tonight, that started out as legislation. This case I was talking to y'all about is about the constitutional amendment language, about the definition of marriage. Didn't we go to the ballot box and settle that issue?
Yes.
Didn't we have 2/3 of the House and Senate vote in favor of it? The governor signed it. We had a constitutional amendment election. Why would a judge be able to go in there and do that? That may be something that's revealed in a questionnaire to give you an idea of what they think about that process, the separations of powers. Make up on some of these issues, so who knows? But I don't see a lot of questionnaires out there on the judicial side, and so I'm hoping that you'll use these questions, whether you decide to use all of them or some of them, but definitely start the conversation. But as I understand it, the judges are in the other room, right? So that's what y'all are going to do next.
Yep.
Y'all are going to go ask them the questions, right?
Right.
We're cut. Y'all are going to storm the room. I found that interesting. I was like, they're all in there, right? They're not allowed. Some of them aren't allowed to come in here. I don't know what's going on there. I found that fascinating. Very good stuff. But anyway, nonetheless, so I apologize. I didn't bring 200 copies or how many the group is here. But just to recap, ask them about whether they think the Constitution is a living document. Are they a strict constructionalist? What current sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice do they identify with their philosophy? What former president would match up with their philosophy on these type of issues? Just a couple of real simple ones. You might ask them what they think about Roe versus Wade. Kind of an important decision. So are we doing Q&A? Okay. Because y'all may have some questions about some of this. I know this is an important topic, and I want you to be as equipped and as encouraged. So let's do that. Sir, go ahead.
My name is John White. I'm running for County Criminal Court number 2. And the thing is, what you're talking about seems to be directed at district judges and judges at that higher level, as opposed to criminal district judges and misdemeanor judges. Would you differentiate between, because criminal judges primarily look at deciding guilt or innocence and then punishing someone?
Sure. That's a very good point. It may be the case that some of these questions don't feel as applicable to someone in your position. The questions that we have are about positions. Historically, our voters guide has been at the higher appellate level. And so some of these questions may fit. You may feel like they don't. I think that's a conversation you have with the voters, and you decide, to work it out between y'all and decide what questions you like, what questions you don't. But
I didn't want us to look bad not answering those.
I understand. I understand. But I will say one of the points I did make is you're in office, and I'm not picking on you, but you asked a question. You, anyone else, may have a point where you're appointed to a higher level position, or maybe you run for a higher level court. I encourage people all the time, particularly at the lower level, city level, county level, do not be afraid to ask questions that people may say, well, I don't really get into that. Well, you may not. I found it interesting that in Travis County, they were using tax dollars to pay for abortions. We banned that at the state level. But Travis County said, no, but we're using county dollars to do that. So that's how we got around it. But people weren't really asking that question before because they thought, well, that's a state issue. They're not dealing with that at the local level. Oh, sure they are. In Austin, they passed a resolution. The city council passed a resolution saying, we think marriage should be defined as not one man and one woman, but there should be so-called marriage equality. Well, didn't we already, like I said, decide that? Why? But these lower level officials do think that they have some sway on this. And I understand their role is different than a judge. But my point is, I think it's fair to get an idea, because whether they're in that position today or you rise to another level, it gives people more information than they had before. Yes, sir.
We have a competitive race for district attorney, which is another type of position. It's not a judge per se. It's actually taking a side in the argument. What can you tell us about that position for questions that you might recommend fit for the district attorney spot?
Yeah, I may ask Wade on this. As far as I'm wondering if the judicial code of conduct applies to a district attorney. I'm not sure the answer to that, but I will say that I do think if you use these questions to help give insight, like I was talking to the gentleman in the back, it could be a way for you to start a conversation to get a better idea of that candidate. And because when you're in a role of a district attorney, you should be in a role of enforcing the law, enforcing the Constitution, unless you're like some of these other elected officials that say, you know what, I don't agree with the Constitution, right? You're going to be the, whatever rogue mayor and say, I disagree with that. We're going to stop doing that. I'm going to issue same-sex marriage licenses like some of these district clerks have been doing in some of these states. People not respecting that role.
One of the things that I think that irritates most people is judges and prosecutors have discretion. And the accountability that goes with that discretion is very difficult for citizens such as yourselves to understand, because it's hard to know when a judge has discretion, when a prosecutor has discretion as to whether to prosecute, whether not to prosecute. And really and truly, the questions you should be asking are questions about how they come to those decisions. What's their philosophy with regard to that? Okay? The question he asked about what's the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I told him earlier, 4 words. Consent of the governed. Okay? So, it's the accountability is what the Constitution is about. And how do judges, prosecutors, district attorneys intend to maintain that connection with the people over whom we sit in government? We govern you. You elect us. How are we going to exercise the authority that you give us? And do we remember that we, in fact, gain our authority from you? Okay? John, I'm going to disagree with John a little bit here. In fact, one of the cases that I talk about all the time about judicial philosophy is Roper versus Simmons. It's a criminal case. It's a case in which the Supreme Court of the United States said you can't execute a 17-year-old. You can't execute an 18-year-old for a capital crime they committed at the age of 17. And the difference in the court had decided it 10 years earlier, and the only thing that changed was Justice Kennedy changed his mind. The Eighth Amendment stayed the same. Cruel and unusual punishment, the language in the Constitution stayed the same. But 5 states had decided they wanted to decide, well, we're not going to execute which was their right to do. They had the right to do that. But because those were the only 5 states that considered that issue in that 10-year period, Justice Stevens decided, well, we have a trend. And we have 5 states that have decided, you know what? That's cruel and unusual punishment. And one of Justice Scalia's best dissents, he goes, what about the 40 states that didn't change their mind? Okay? So the discussion, you can ask questions. Now, I cannot tell you how I'm going to decide something. I cannot do it. And I was telling Jonathan this. When people have asked me whether I'm pro-life or not, I say, you do not want to tell me that. Ask me that. And the reason is because it has consequences as to whether I can decide a case later on. But you can ask me who I give to, if I've been on any boards, if I've done this, if I've been involved in the case that we were dealing with was the ability of a pastor to actually act as a pastor without the state telling him, we're going to control how you act as a pastor. So, what have they been involved in? That's perfectly fine.
Well, and here, and to sum it up, we've seen a trend in our country, in our state, and other places that judges either have lost their way or they don't care about what they're supposed to be doing, and they have fully embraced and are practicing this role of being policymakers from the bench. And they're not answering the questions. They're not getting grilled on some of this stuff. They're not worried about re-election. Maybe they're federal judges. So they don't care. They really think they have a responsibility to solve these problems, if you will. The problems that you're supposed to be solving, or the people you elect in the legislature are supposed to be solving. Not people that, have one vote on this issue and have not been analyzing it, and from their bench make a sweeping decision just because they say, I think it's unconstitutional, even though the people went to the ballot and voted that way. And just by having this conversation and this discussion, asking these questions, I think you'll make a significant impact of reminding judges that they no longer can get away from legislating from the bench, from being confused about what it means from the separation of powers, and they can no longer run from the accountability of the people. So I'm glad that y'all have taken interest in this issue, and because we're in a church, I want to leave with one of my favorite verses from the Bible that I'm sure y'all very well are in practice of. And it says, he who presents his case first seems right until someone steps forward to challenge him. So that's what the Tea Party does. That's what you guys keep doing. That's what I'm going to keep doing. And so I'm glad to be a part of your important efforts. So thank you very much.
Okay, guys, this is how it's going to work. So the media, all the song and dance is all gone. This is just us. We're normal people that have to make a decision about who we're going to vote for. Did you see this list? There's double-sided, tons of candidates on there. They're all waiting for you in the dining hall. Just have conversations with them. Take as long as you need. Get your questions answered. At the bottom of this backside, okay, there's a link to what he mentioned about how the other judges have rated all of the other people, and that's going to be a great resource. You may not make your decision tonight, but use that as a resource when you get home. And what was the link to the questions?
Freevotersguide.com.
Freevotersguide.com. So if you need that tonight, just pull it up on your phone, okay? But they're here to talk to you, so don't waste their time, okay? Thanks. Have a good night.